In our introductory management videos, we've been looking at the role of management. And so we started by looking at what does it mean to be a manager? What are the functions of a manager? And then we looked at the skills, the characteristics of effective managers. And one of those skills or characteristics is to be an effective decision maker. So we looked at how we make decisions. For the remainder of these videos, we're then looking at the decisions that managers make. And so in our previous videos, we looked at decisions that management makes in terms of type of ownership, type of structure of the organization. And now what we're going to look at this week is we are going to look at how we go about producing goods or services. So we need to make a decision in terms of what we're going to make, how we're going to make it. Are we using the most productive or efficient methods in doing so? So what we're looking at this week is we're looking at production or operations management. So how do we improve our operations? So in operations management, these are any of the activities or resources that create goods or provide services. So that's going to be everything from deciding your production process to looking at how much you actually need to make, so forecasting demand, and then bridging the gap between the amount you're able to produce and the amount you need to produce, so doing capacity planning. And as we look at production, we need to make sure that we have the necessary employees in place, they're motivated, they're trained, and they're scheduled to work. We also need to make sure that we have the materials we need to do that production. So we need to look at how we buy the materials, our supply chain, how we manage that inventory. When it comes to operations, you also need to decide where you're going to locate your facility, how you're going to lay out that building, and then as you are producing, are you maintaining quality? So there's a number of operations management functions, and I have a whole set of videos on all of these functions. You'll find that in the operations management playlist. But our focus today is an intro management level, so we're going to focus on essentially some of the key functions of operations, which is the production process. So when we look at producing goods or providing services, we need to decide what is the value added. That is, what is the difference between the cost of the inputs and the value or the price of the outputs. So in other words, if a customer is going to pay you for something you do or something you make, what is it that you are doing that adds value? Why doesn't the customer just make or do those things themselves? So we go from inputs where we have our building, our workers, our equipment, we have our raw materials, we have our information, our knowledge. Those are all the things that go into making a good. For example, we could make a can of Coke. Or providing a service, so we could be a hair salon providing a haircut. And so how do we go from all of those inputs to the output, the product of the can of Coke or having the haircut? So what is that transformation? What is it that we are doing that is adding value? I'll come back to those in a moment, but there are different types of transformations. So when it comes to transformations, you could make something. So people are paying you to take those raw materials and turn it into a final product. That's a physical transformation. So we make a can of Coke, it's a physical transformation. Your company could also provide locational transformation. So you move something. You are not the maker. You are maybe even not the seller, but you are responsible for either storing or moving. So when we think about companies like DHL, like FedEx, they are locational. They are transport. There are also companies that provide groceries to the grocery store, the food to the restaurant, and so that's locational transformation. So if you warehouse or you transport, you're adding value by moving something, locational transformation. There's also a type of transformation called exchange. So if you are the Hudson Bay Company, you are Old Navy, then your providing value added by making the goods available where the customer is. So Hudson Bay Company didn't make the shirt. They probably paid a different company to transport it, to bring it to where they're located, but the value they're adding is that they are actually making it available where the customers are. The next type of transformation is physiological. So we're changing the sense of being. So if we're a healthcare company, we're going to fix a broken leg. So if we're changing the body, then we are adding value there. That's physiological. If you're changing the mind, then it is psychological. So for example, if we talk about entertainment, so you're showing a movie, you make people laugh, you make people cry, they're changing how they feel. That is a psychological transformation. And the last type of transformation we're going to look at here is informative. So you add value by providing knowledge. So this would be a newspaper or a radio station, a blog, provides information. So in all of these different methods, we are going from inputs to outputs. We're adding value by doing something, making something, so the customer doesn't have to. Okay. Now, when it comes to those outputs, you can have goods like the can of Coke, or you can have services like the haircut. Goods are tangible things people want, so you can touch them. Services are intangible things that people want, so we can't touch them. So tangible has a physical form, intangible is an experience. There are differences between goods and services. When it comes to services, time is more important, so timeliness. When we look at goods, it's easier to measure defects, deviations, quality assurance is easier because you have standardized inputs and standardized outputs. When it comes to services, quality can be amended on the go, but it's much harder to measure. When it comes to goods, right, inventory can be stored. We can produce a bunch and then sell it, whereas services happen in real time, working with the customer. So there are differences in goods and services. When it comes to goods and services in Canada, which one do you think we make more of? Okay. When it comes to jobs, most of the jobs are in services. So you can see over 75% of the jobs in Canada have been services since at least 2008. And if we look at our GDP, gross domestic product, the total value of everything we make, we can see that in terms of value, 72% of the total value of everything we make comes from services. So in Canada, our jobs, our money, all comes from providing services. So if you're working along with us in the course, what we're working on this next couple weeks is making gingerbread houses. So if we have a gingerbread house, like you can see here, what are the inputs and outputs for the gingerbread house? So what do we need to make the gingerbread house? That's the input, okay? And then the output, of course, is the gingerbread house. Then we need to identify the value added. Why can't the customer just create this themselves? What is it we are doing for them? And so what type of transformation is creating a gingerbread house? Since we're focused here on production, we're going to move through time, looking at the evolution of management, and the focus during the classical period of management is really on production. How can we find the best way to make something so that we get the most bang for our buck? Well, if we look at the time period before the Industrial Revolution, this is a time period before we have big equipment and factories, where we have highly skilled workers using simple, flexible tools to produce small quantities of customized goods. So think about it as a tailor hand-making clothes for you, someone hand-making shoes for you, And so each item is made specifically with the customer in mind. So what type of process design would that be? Well, first, what are the 4 types of process design? We have job shop, batch, repetitive, and continuous. And so because we have tools that are very general purpose, the quantity is low, the variety is high, we have a job shop. What type of organizational structure do we have? So what were the 2 kind of general categories of organizational structure? We had the organic, more team-based, highly adaptive, less vertical structure. And then on the other side, we had more mechanistic. Mechanistic was highly formalized. Okay, so we had roles in terms of who reports to who. The main decisions were made at the top, so very centralized, and it was highly specialized. Each person did a particular role. So if we look at this time period, are we more organic or mechanistic? Well, during this period of craft production, what we have in terms of businesses are the government, religious institutions, and craft guilds. So if we look at how a craft guild operates, we have a master, so someone who is the expert, an expert tailor, and then we have a journeyman. So this is someone who doesn't own their own shop. Okay, they work for the master. And then we have an apprentice, someone who is studying in that area of expertise. So given that we have the master, the journeyman, the apprentice, is this more organic or more mechanistic? Well, even though it's a job shop, a smaller operation, it would have been very mechanistic. The master makes all of the decisions, so a high level of centralization. It is highly formalized, so everyone has a specific role and responsibilities. There are things that the journeyman's allowed to do. There are things the apprentice is allowed to do, and it's very structured. Okay. So at the time, the roles were much more mechanistic. As we evolve over time, we'll see a movement towards more organic organizational structure. But we did have highly skilled workers and producing small quantities, high variety, so it was more of a job shop. Now, the challenge with this is that production is slow and costly because everything is made specific for a person, and there's no economies of scale. So the idea behind economies of scale is that as you produce a greater quantity, your cost per unit goes down. So if we think about buying a big machine, it costs a lot of money to buy the equipment, but the more you can produce, the more you can spread out the cost of that machine across all these different units. So larger scale production allows for economies of scale and allows for the cost per unit to go down. With the job shop design in this craft production, it's costly production because the uniqueness of each unit for each customer. So you don't have the cost savings that comes from producing large quantities. So that's going to lead us into the Industrial Revolution period. So we're looking around 1776. We have Adam Smith writing The Wealth of Nations. So those of you who are taking economics or you're watching my economics videos, we talk about Adam Smith, the father of economics, and his book, The Wealth of Nations. The focus really on this book in terms of how we can increase the wealth of nations is to have a competitive economy where we use divisions of labor to increase productivity. So that is, we have a high level of specialization. We divide up the jobs into unique roles, and this allows us to make more and lower the cost per unit. So those of you who've taken economics, you've talked already about divisions of labor, or of course you can check out my videos that relate to microeconomics and the marginal product of labor and the cost curves. So these graphs we also discuss in our microeconomics videos. So I'll provide a link to those at the top of the screen and in the descriptions. So with divisions of labor, we're breaking up production into smaller tasks. This was actually first described by Xenophon, and this was a Greek military general who was really advocating for this divisions of labor. When you have divisions of labor, so if we have a set process and we each do a unique task, then as we add additional workers, so that's our labor here, as we add additional workers, we're going to get more out of each additional worker. So that is the marginal product of labor. So that's the additional amount that's produced, the extra quantity. So that's going to be the change in quantity from having a change in workers. So how much extra are we going to produce when we add that additional worker? So as you add each additional worker, we're actually collectively able to make more, because if you think about it, if we have two people working separately, and the sample we've been working through is making a gingerbread house, but if I sit here and make a gingerbread house myself, and you sit there and make a gingerbread house yourself, there's only so much we can make. But if I assemble the walls and you assemble the decoration, we have divisions of labor, and then we can think of it as an assembly line where we're then able to make more together than individually. Now, this only works as long as when we add people, there is additional jobs for them to do. So we add someone to make one wall or two sets of walls. It's a house, so it's got 4 walls. So if I make one corner, you make the next corner, somebody else adds the decorations, we're going to continue to see that marginal product of labor go up. But if we start adding more and more people, and there's really nothing new for them to do, so now we're just having 2 people each make walls, 3 people each do decorations, they're not adding as much as the person before, and so eventually that marginal product of labor is going to fall. Adding the additional people is not going to add anything to our production. Well, if we look at how much we're getting out of each worker, that's going to impact the marginal cost. This is going to be the extra cost, so here's a change in cost from producing one more unit. Okay, so if we are going to make one more unit, how much extra is it going to cost us? Well, initially, if the workers are each able to add more to the production, then our costs are going to go down. Okay, the additional cost to make one more unit is going to go down. And these little triangles that you see here, this just means change. It's a mathematical symbol, delta, means change. So the change, the extra cost from change of quantity. All right, so as long as that marginal product of labor is going up, the marginal cost will go down. However, when we keep adding workers and they're not able to add as much as the workers before, that means the extra cost of the worker is now spread across less additional units, and so that marginal cost is going to start to go up. What that means then is that the total cost, which is not just the cost of the worker, but also the cost of our equipment and our materials, initially as we produce more, our workers are adding more than the people before, and we're able to spread out those fixed costs, that machine, that equipment, take advantage of that economies of scale we were talking about, and so our average total cost goes down. And even though as we keep producing, we can spread out the cost of the building, the cost of the machines, and that'll keep going down per unit. The problem is if the workers aren't adding more to production, then the overall cost per unit is going to go up. So when we're looking at divisions of labor, we're really looking at how can we get the lowest cost per unit by taking advantage of the fact that when the workers specialize, they each are adding more than the person before, which is going to make the extra cost to make goods go down and pull down that per unit cost. We're very briefly discussing this here, so if a lot of that went over your head, don't worry. In microeconomics, we'll go through the calculations in detail. And of course, as I said, I will link to the videos here if you want more information about calculating marginal product of labor, marginal cost, and our average total cost. So the focus during this period of time really is on increasing productivity. How do we get more out of workers as we move them to the factories during this Industrial Revolution period of time? So Adam Smith is advocating for divisions of labor, so specialization in terms of we each do one job. And then we have Eli Whitney during similar period, and he is looking at the idea of interchangeable parts. Now, we recognize that as we look at the history of management, it is full of people that did questionable things that are not politically correct, that we wouldn't advocate for today. So Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which did lead to the rise in slavery in the United States because of cotton production. So as we look at historical figures in management and their theories, recognize that we take some things from them and we leave other pieces behind. And as you look at your role as a manager, recognizing what you accept and what you don't accept going forward in your role and how you see yourself as a manager. So we bring up Eli Whitney because he invented interchangeable parts. Well, how interchangeable parts works is that we no longer have to customize each unit, each inventory, each raw material piece to fit our production. And so Eli Whitney used this in terms of gun manufacturing to make it more efficient. But an example of interchangeable parts today would be comparing WestJet and United. So I have flown WestJet across Canada. I've flown United as I could fly to the States. Well, one time when I was flying, I was stuck at the Calgary airport because the United flight that I was on, a piece of the plane had broken and they didn't have any replacement parts. And so we had to wait until the next plane came in from Houston to Calgary with the replacement parts, have them fix the plane, and then we could fly out. Okay. When you fly WestJet, they rarely have these types of disruptions because the planes that WestJet has in its fleet are all very similar. They use similar components, which means each plane doesn't need a different or unique piece. They can have a stash at the airport of common components of the plane, and so if there is an issue of any of the WestJet planes, they can take those components and put it into any of the planes. They don't have to wait for the next plane to come in with the missing part. So here we have interchangeable parts because we don't have to manufacture it unique for each situation, because we can change them out and use them in various different places. Then that allows us to be more efficient in our production. So unlike United, which then had a plane delayed for like 8 hours, then WestJet's only delayed for 30 minutes, an hour, and they're on their way. So we're looking at ways to increase our production process in order to get more produced and make those costs per units go down. So interchangeable parts, the parts of a product are made to such precision they don't have to be custom fitted. So what we see with the Industrial Revolution as we're moving through the history of management is that we're moving from that craft production where we have highly skilled workers, but the quantity is low, the variety is high, so it's slow and costly, moving to a period of time where we have factory production, large-scale manufacturing. We're using machines and equipment, so we see technology like spinning jenny, flying shuttle, steam engines, These are allowing for much larger scale production, and we're moving to a process where we have more divisions of labor. So each person does one role, which means we no longer require highly skilled workers, and we can reduce the time it takes to make something and make that per unit cost go down.